Good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast, and welcome to SFS alumni in time zones all across the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the SFS, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to another one of our Fast Break sessions, our 30-minute deep dive into the issues making the headlines in international affairs. And what an important issue we have teed up for discussion today: the joint U.S. Israeli attack on Iran and the prospects for a wider war in the Middle East. With us today is one of the very best of SFS, Professor Dan Byman. He's former director of our Security Studies program. He's director of the Warfare, Irregular Threats and Terrorism program at CSIS. He's an editor at Lawfare and a previous member of the Department of State's International Security Advisory Board when the Department of State was actually taking advice from an international board. He's the author of too many books to mention, and his authoritative commentary on security issues in the Middle East can be found just about everywhere. But especially today, look for his most recent pieces in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy magazine about what we're going to be discussing today. Before we begin, I want to let you know that I will be monitoring the Q&A function and will integrate your questions into our moderated discussion. And this conversation will be posted on our SFS YouTube channel along with all of our other fast breaks. And one last note, we'll be talking today about the impact that these attacks have had on security in the Middle East, or will have on security in the Middle East, and not the domestic implications of these attacks. And as you know, thousands of courageous Iranians have been killed protesting this brutal regime, and so many of our own SFS alumni from the Iranian diaspora have been devastated to watch the violence. We hope to cover the domestic implications with an Iran expert as the situation unfolds, but this will look at the wider issues for the region. So now over to Dan. Dan, let me start with a core question. We've heard multiple objectives from multiple individuals about this set of attacks: destroying Iran's nuclear capacity, undermining support for its support for terrorism around the world, stopping the repression of its own people, even regime change. Each one of these objections would likely require a different strategy. Can the U.S. and Israel reconcile them in one operation?
So that's going to be exceptionally difficult. Um, each of the objectives, as you said, is ambitious, and they are especially difficult to do when you're only using air and naval assets, not putting ground troops in, and when you want to do this for a relatively short period of time. So the question that's kind of rolling around in my mind is the president has laid out really a litany of longstanding U.S. grievances against Iran, and his senior advisors have echoed different parts of these. Which ones are the real ones? And a related question in my mind is, will the president simply change the objectives depending on how well he feels the operation is going? Where if things look really positive, he might go with the most ambitious regime change focused ones. But if the costs start to heat up, he might simply say, my goal was to strike a better deal over the nuclear program and settle for that. My sense from both my read of the news and my understanding of what's going on in the administration is there is not the traditional policy process where you have different parts of the government putting forth policy options. They're adjudicated at the White House, and then directives go out to the bureaucracies to implement them. Rather, it's a much more chaotic system, and a lot seems to change really by the hour, depending on what the president decides at that particular moment.
Now, the objectives might change and the rhetoric might change, but presumably the force required and the strategy required to implement that force would change with each one of the objectives. What do you see that's likely to go forward given the nature of force that has been used? Is this the beginning of an extended war? Is it really just a multi-day bomb campaign, a potential in and out to decapitate the regime? What do you sort of see given the force that has been mobilized for this effort?
So the force is both very big and at the same time limited. It's the largest U.S. force that's been deployed to the region since the outbreak of since the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, but with the important caveat that there are not significant ground troops in the region, and also there are at best limited numbers of special operations forces in the region. So that's going to limit what you can do. The kind of snatch and grab operation the United States did in Venezuela requires special operations forces. And most of the time, when you're talking about replacing a regime, you're talking about either a significant U.S. Presence on the ground or local militias you can work with, both of which are largely lacking in Iran today, although there is talk of the United States supporting Kurds in western parts of Iran. Um, so the type of force is really a more coercive one, where it's putting a lot of pressure on the Iranian regime. The Israeli force operating side by side is killing lots of Iranian leaders. They do seem to be trying, at least to some degree, to reduce the ability of Iran to coerce its own people. But there are going to be limits as to what this can accomplish. The nuclear program already was severely set back last year in the 12-day Israeli campaign, along with the U.S. Operation Midnight Hammer. And so, can it be set back further? Sure. But that's going to require really a deal with the Iranians where they openly agree to give up all nuclear enrichment with high kind of certainty based on inspections and so on. You can destroy, and Iran's, this is happening, Iran's missile program to some degree, reducing launchers and so on, but that can be rebuilt, especially a lot of Iran's short-range systems and a lot of the unmanned drones that are causing such problems. A trickier one is Iran's proxy forces. Iran has backed these since the Islamic Revolution began. The relationship with the Lebanese Hezbollah, its closest proxy, began in the early 1980s when Iran helped form it. And Iranian leaders of all stripes see these as instruments of Iranian power. So the pressure on Iran could force Iran to try to make a deal where they cut off support for these, but that's going to be difficult. So, in my view at least, most of what the United States has deployed is really a way of making life very difficult for the Iranian regime to the point of killing lots of people, putting lots of pressure on the government, raising fears that it won't be able to stay in power, and in so doing, getting a better deal on things like missiles, the nuclear program, and proxies. I think the regime replacement aspects is going to be much, much harder.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how Iran has responded and how you see that. What do we know about Iran's attack so far? Is this just a kind of indiscriminate use of projectiles to create as much appearance of a response as possible, with the hope that some of these projectiles will reach targets in the region? Or is there some sense of strategy that you see in terms of Iran's marshaling of force? And then we'll get to the proxies in a minute.
So, Iran, in my view, has two goals with its use of force. And the first, and this is important, is domestic. No one expects Iran to defeat the United States and Israel. That's not the kind of expectation anyone has. But if Iran can say, we're punching back, yes, we're being bombed, yes, we're losing leaders, yes, there are real costs being inflicted on us, but look at the other guys, right? They're suffering too. That's a way of shoring up support among key supporters in Iran for the regime. And remember, this is a regime that is very concerned about its own survival. And being able to tell its supporters that it's fighting back is very important. Iran's strategy so far seems to be try to raise the cost of the operation to the United States. And they see U.S. allies in the region, the Gulf states, Turkey, of course, Israel, as complicit in this operation, and that, in my view, is overstated, but nevertheless, there is some reality to that. And they also believe that these are relative weak points, that by imposing suffering on these states, they in turn have influence in Washington, and that will change the regime decision making. So Iran is, if you will, trying to counter course the United States. And some of that, in effect, is indiscriminate because the better targets are better defended. And one of the difficulties for the United States is, although it has air superiority, it's hard to defend everything everywhere. And thus, Iran, if a few things get through, if they can find a few less defended targets, they're still able to inflict pain. We've seen this with the risk to energy markets as just one example. We've seen the chaos caused to travel. We've seen the difficulties for people living in the Gulf states, including Georgetown students at our Doha campus. And all this is a way of making the cost of this operation higher. And I actually think there's potential in this. You're always rolling the dice when you're doing this. One likely result is that the Gulf states are going to move even closer to the United States and support operations against Iran. But there isn't, at least for now, significant support for this operation in the United States. And so by having rising prices at the pump, there is a possibility that Trump might respond to this. Polls taken as the war has commenced to show there isn't strong support for this. Only a minority of Americans support the bombing. Some of the people on this call may know the name Kareem Sajadpour, who's a leading Iran specialist. And he says this is one of the few wars where the people being bombed are probably more supportive of the operation than the people doing the bombing, right? And so Iran may be saying, look, we can tip the balance in the United States as one way of ending the pain. So a lot of different possibilities here, but that's my sense of where Iran is, why Iran is trying to attack the targets it is.
Now, if Iran actually is able to prolong this war beyond a multi-day bombing campaign by the U.S. and Israel, if Iran can continue to put up projectiles to Qatar, as our students are sort of seeing, in Dubai and elsewhere in the region, and each one of those relatively inexpensive drones and projectiles required very expensive and limited anti-ballistic and other efforts to prevent them from moving. Is there a potential for a strategy of allowing or enabling Iran? Could they prolong this and by prolonging it, essentially weaken the ability of the United States and Israel and other regional powers to resist the kind of warfare that they are engaging in?
Certainly, I think one of Iran's goals is, I don't want to say prolonging, but I will say simply surviving with the ability to punch back. Right. So if they can say on day 25 of the war and day 50 of the war, we're still standing and we're still able to fight back, that's actually an impressive accomplishment. Now, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention and appropriately so is the back and forth between Iranian attacks and American air defenses. And even before the war broke out, there were revelations that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, warned that the United States lacks certain types of critical munitions for air defense in sufficient numbers. And we're seeing that stressed right now, where there's tremendous demand throughout the region for air defense. And some of it's being done through very fancy systems, but some of it's just being done by less advanced naval systems. But it's still at times overwhelming. So some shots get through. And even if these systems have a very impressive 95% success rate, that's still a fair number of Iranian attacks that fall through. But the flip side is Iran itself only has a finite number of these things. The stockpiles are being targeted, but also Israel has gone after launchers. And part of Israel's goal was if they can reduce the number being launched at a given time, that makes it much easier for air defense. You can prevent large salvos from going up at once and kind of pick off what's being attacked. So I look at Iran and I say, and my thinking is that they are very much focused on survival, not only for its own sake, of course, but also as a strategy of victory, where they can emerge from the rubble, dust themselves off, and say, yes, we were hit hard, but we are not defeated. And over time, the pressure is going to grow on the Trump administration. And that can be through complaints of allies that are concerned about the utter disruption of their economies and the lives of their citizens. It can be through higher energy prices. It can be through the occasional Iranian attack that kills an American or, as we've already seen with an Israeli attack, attacks on Iran that inadvertently lead to large numbers of civilian deaths. So there's lots of ways that the pressure on the Trump administration could increase and lead to an end in operations.
One of the pressures we haven't spoken about, and there are some questions about it, is the disruption to the oil supply in the Straits of Hormuz. What do you think of the prospects of an extended um, uh, impact on the transit through the Straits of Hormuz? What's the likelihood of reopening traffic, and how would that impact the cost of this operation?
So the number of tankers, both oil and natural gas, that have gone through the strait in recent days has plummeted. And this is tremendously disruptive to both markets. And the depending on which country you're talking about, depending on whether it's gas or oil, you see different levels of stockpiles and different levels of sensitivity. But certainly the pain is already being felt, and that's only going to increase. Right now, it's a risk question. So Iran has said, look, no one should go through the Straits. And because it has anti-ship cruise missiles, because it has drone systems, the tankers are being very cautious, and understandably so. Insurers are less willing to insure. Prices are going way up. President Trump has announced the U.S. Navy may provide escort. Um, that's definitely a doable task. The Navy has been preparing to go against Iran for decades. And in fact, the United States did this sort of operation in the 1980s. But this is a time-consuming task. It's not something that solves the problem overnight. And even if you do have escorts, it's not the sort of thing where huge numbers can go back and forth relatively rapidly. Everything slows down. So this is an Iranian stick it can wield. The caveat, though, is Iran's military forces are weak. They're clearly outmatched by U.S. forces. And when you are threatening global energy supplies, you get countries like China as well as the Europeans that, while certainly not happy about what the United States is doing, are also putting pressure on Iran not to do operations that jeopardize their own economic security.
One of the things that is of deep concern about this attack is the potential for engaging and initiating even further actions from the proxies that support Iran in the region and beyond. One of the things that you've yourself written about, of course, is Hezbollah. We know the Houthis, we've got Shiites in Iraq and elsewhere. What do you think? What do you expect to see from the proxies?
So we've already seen Hezbollah join the fray, but in a very limited way. And to me, this reflects the relative weakness of most proxy forces. Um, so one thing that Israel has done quite systematically in the last 2.5 years is destroy the proxy forces that most threaten Israel, and some of that overlaps with the United States. So Israel has decimated Hamas, and in 2024, Israel's campaign against Hezbollah was also utterly overwhelming. And thus, when Hezbollah did very limited attacks on Israel quite recently, probably at Iran's behest, Israel was able to stop them quite efficiently and put a lot of pressure on Lebanon to the point where the Lebanese government and others are saying to Hezbollah, don't do this, right? You're taking what little strength and prosperity we have in this country and destroying it. When you get to other proxies, you get more question marks. There are some parts of the kind of broader Iraqi popular mobilization forces that are very loyal to Tehran, and Iran will call in these favors as Iran gets desperate. When we start to talk about the Houthis, there, to me, it's a genuine question mark. The Houthis are certainly receive significant amounts of Iranian aid, but they're not Hezbollah. They're not incredibly close to the Iranians. They don't have the same deep ideological ties. They don't have the many years of really intimate coordination. But the Houthis are relatively strong. They've shown they can harass shipping in the Bab el-Mandab region, and they could easily do it again. Now, they did make a ceasefire with the Trump administration last year, and that has held. So it looks like Iran is trying to call in favors, but only some of its proxies are responding, and those tend to be the weaker ones. The one point I would highlight on this that we haven't seen, thankfully, is the greater risk of international terrorism. In the past, Iran has done terrorist attacks really around the world. We've seen them in Europe, we've seen them in Argentina, we've seen attempted Iranian attacks in places like Thailand. And one thing that Iran has been more cautious on are terrorist attacks on the United States and the U.S. homeland. People like me have often said that's incredibly risky and escalatory for Iran, and they would only do that under extreme circumstances, such as when the regime feels its own hold on power is threatened. Well, right now, the regime's hold on power is being threatened, right? Those extraordinary circumstances for Iran are happening. So a lot comes down to Iran's capability. Does it have the ability to strike in the United States? Where does it have active cells? And I suspect there's a strong spy versus spy set of operations going on right now, where the United States and its allies are trying to track Iranian operatives everywhere. And from Iran's point of view, as the IRA once said about trying to kill Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, we only have to get lucky once, right? That if they try 10 plots and one succeeds and blows up one U.S. embassy, that is a failure for the United States, despite the many disruptive plots. So that's another space to watch. Sometimes when we talk about international terrorism, things can get rather histrionic, but I think the risk at least is much higher.
Well, look, if you think about the region as a whole, if you think about the network of proxies, if you think about the risks of international terrorism, as you just described, if you think about what's likely to happen to the regime as a result of this attack, as there are multiple scenarios in which the regime can survive, in which the regime might change, which the regime may survive in a very, very different form with Khamenei gone. What do you think is the most likely one or two or three scenarios? How would you sort of rank where you think the likely scenarios are going to come out as a result of this set of attacks?
So my bet would be on some variant of the current regime emerging from the rubble. That at some point the United States and Israel believe it's not worth sustaining operations. The Iranian regime, whatever is left, offers a deal, and that could be a very favorable deal. Even more willingness to bend on the nuclear program, perhaps to the point of full concessions and simply getting rid of it altogether in a real sense. Some concessions on things like proxies and missile forces, and Iran might do that out of genuine panic that it's going to collapse, or just a belief that if it waits out the current crisis, a year from now, 2 years from now, we can start to cheat on these things. And that's quite plausible to me. So I think the most likely scenario is some form of survival of this regime with concessions. A variant of that is it effectively becomes a military dictatorship run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, where you still might have a notional cleric who has a notional senior job, but in reality, the power balance has shifted. And this was a possibility even before the latest attacks. The late Supreme Leader, I want to say, was 86. He was certainly in his mid 80s, and there were questions about succession and who would take over. Um, Another possibility is regime change, but in my view, not in the way people are talking about. I think demonstrators taking control is relatively unlikely just because one side has all the guns and one side is better organized. And even if only around 10% of the regime, of the population supports the regime, if that 10% has the guns, I think that's enough. However, one source of regime change in the Middle East and in the world is military failure. We saw this in 1948 in the Middle East when Israel won, and then again in 67, where you had regime after regime collapse because the population was disappointed with the performance of their government. We saw this in the Falklands War, where the Argentine loss led to the military regime being overthrown there. And the Iranian regime has told its people for decades, we are fighting Israel. We are fighting the United States. You need to make sacrifices in order to win this fight. And losing a war, perhaps in a really one-sided, humiliating fashion, is going to discredit this regime further, and its disastrous economic performance, its willingness to shoot huge numbers of its own people, all that may have already reduced its legitimacy to close to zero. And so I can imagine scenarios where a new, probably military-led government comes in that is more pragmatic, perhaps, but is willing to distance itself, at least to some degree, from the current regime.
Would it reduce the risks to the region? Would it reduce the risks for support for terrorism? Would it reduce the support for proxies, or could it, in fact, make some of those matters even worse in that scenario?
For the most part, this would be a step in the right direction. I'm not sure I would expect huge improvements in the human rights situation, although we can certainly hope for that. But the line that people used to use about the Soviet Union, that you wanted to operate as a nation, not as an idea, right? That applies to some degree for Iran. You don't want Iran to be supporting revolution around the Middle East when in fact that often doesn't serve Iran's national interest. And you can imagine a more traditional government that focuses on the neighborhood and Iran's immediate security interests. With regard to nuclear power, Iran has probably gotten the worst of all worlds in this. It doesn't have a nuclear weapon, doesn't have the deterrent power that comes with a nuclear weapon, but it's paid a tremendous economic price, a political price, and now a military price for that program. And you could imagine a more pragmatic regime coming in saying, sure, we'd like nuclear weapons, but it just is not worth the price. And the result, though, would be a stronger Iran, but one that is much less revolutionary, much less hostile, perhaps to the United States and Israel, but in general, less aggressive. Here, I would like to point out, I think there may be a difference between how the Israel sees the situation, how the United States sees it, where Israel in general, I think would prefer a much weaker Iran and believing Iran is likely to be hostile and therefore you want it divided and off balance. While I think the United States would be okay with a stronger Iran that was less directly opposed to U.S. interests.
Does this give any credence to what you might call a Trump, if a Trump strategy is emerging? It's a strategy of decapitating presidents or leaders who he sees as threatening either the U.S. interests or the region, to not pursue regime change as part of that, to not pursue democratic reform as part of that, but to use the threat as a way to temper the potential risks that they pose. We see it in the beginnings of that strategy in Venezuela. And to some extent, obviously, Trump is trying to repeat that, and he's in his own statements repeat that in Iran. What do you make of this decapitation strategy, and how effective can it be in actually reducing the risks?
So it's at least plausible, but I think the relative incoherence of U.S. objectives makes that much harder. It's kind of hard for the Iranians to say yes at this point because it's a little unclear what the, not a little unclear, it's very unclear what the United States is demanding. President Trump has said publicly that his administration identified several Iranians that we believe the United States can do business with, but that they were killed. Right. So you have this kind of incoherence in terms of who we want the kind of Delcy Rodriguez person to be, right? Who we want the successor whom we can work with. Um, and a worry I have is that Iranians will rise up and they'll be again killed in large numbers, with the United States really washing its hands of any responsibility. Um, this does set back the missile program somewhat. It sets back the nuclear program, but in my view, neither of those was an imminent threat in any way. A lot is going to depend on whether the United States can use diplomacy along with military force and to try to extract meaningful long-term concessions as part of this. And that's quite possible. But so far, this administration does not seem to have set up a plan for doing so and is not doing what you'd want to do, which is working closely with allies to maximize your leverage.
Can you talk maybe as we close, and we think about the allies in the region? uh, Obviously, this is a joint operation between Israel and the U.S. That sets a new standard of engagement between the United States and Israel. If you could talk a little bit about that, and if you can also then talk about how the Gulf states have been engaged in this whole process. Is this something the Gulf states were encouraging? We know Israel was encouraging it, but with attacks now in the Emirates, in Qatar, and elsewhere in the region, what are the Gulf states, and how is this shaping relations between the U.S. and the Gulf states?
So I'll start briefly with the Gulf states and then go on to Israel. Um, there's probably variation in the Gulf states. Initially, in January, they were putting out statements saying they were opposed to military operations, and there were debates about whether that was genuine or just a way of providing themselves with some cover both at home and with regard to Iran. And we know countries like the UAE have been extremely anti-Iran and have, in some ways, been seeing the Iranian shadow behind every tree and have been intervening in places like Yemen in part due to what they saw as excessive Iranian influence in the region. So I think some Gulf states are probably for this, but they're all expecting the United States to protect them, right? And attacks on their countries, especially if they continue for sustained periods of time, are going to lead them to ask the question of whether the United States is an effective security provider. But for now, they actually don't have much choice. There is no one else they can really turn to defend themselves against Iran. With Israel, it's a bit more complex. Um, the Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, is an exceptionally cynical politician in many ways. But one area where I don't doubt him is his real focus on Iran. For 25 years, he has focused on Iran, and especially the nuclear program. And he clearly wants to use military power, including U.S. military power, to eliminate this threat. But there are some caveats here. Israel has been fighting wars for more than 2 years now, and it's exhausted the society. It has posed tremendous strains on the reserves. There have been financial costs. And this is something that is difficult to sustain. I think Israel is cynical about what comes next in Iran, and their goal is simply to weaken Iran militarily. But it's also worth pointing out that this is a rare, true military partnership. Usually, when the United States fights with allies, there's a notional allied aircraft or two or warship or two, but the United States is doing all the lifting. Here, there's a real division of labor where Israel is flying as a full partner or close to full partner with the United States. And that's quite remarkable. It helps Prime Minister Netanyahu at home. He's able to say that he has delivered on his promise to weaken the Iran, and also he's delivered the United States. He has brought the United States fully to Israel's side. So I think this has political benefits to Netanyahu as well as strategic benefits in how he sees Israel's role in the region.
Well, we're going to have to stop it there. There are just so many issues that this raises. I know that we are going to be having more fast breaks as this situation evolves. And as I said before, we really haven't gotten into the situation for the Iranian people and how they are going to be impacted by the various set of scenarios, which we will then focus on in future discussions. But for now, I want to thank you, Dan, for your insights. I want to remind everyone to look out for Dan's writings in foreign policy, in foreign affairs, and elsewhere. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in for this fast break. And we look forward to hearing from you and engaging with you again in the weeks to come. Again, don't remember that this is being taped and will be available on our SFS YouTube channel along with all the other fast break editions that we've done. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.